I'm the kind of guy who likes a good joke. You know the kind. Always the one sitting at the barbecue with a cold beer in one hand and flipping burgers with the other, making dumb dad jokes that make my kids groan and my friends roll their eyes. I thought that was the joke. A harmless gift in shiny paper during the annual neighborhood potluck. I should have known better. Hey, Mike, Greg said, holding out the box to me. You should check this out. Maybe it'll turn out you're part Viking or something. He grinned like he just told the funniest joke ever. Greg is exactly that kind of guy. Always laughing the loudest, the first to offer another drink, and the last to leave the party. He's also my oldest friend, the guy who was best man at my wedding, and my kid's self-proclaimed fun uncle. In the box was a DNA test kit. One of those find your roots, ones they advertise on TV where people cry when they find out they're 5% Irish or something. I chuckled, more out of politeness than anything else, and held out the box to everyone who wanted one. Looks like I'm finally going to find out why I burn so much in the sun, I joked. Everyone laughed, including my wife Sarah, who rolled her eyes as she does when I act like an idiot. We put the box on the counter and forgot about it for a few weeks. Life was busy, as it always is with 2 kids under 6. Between work, going to school, and toddler tantrums, the DNA kit was the last thing on my mind. But one evening, when the kids were asleep and we'd finished off a bottle of wine, Sarah pulled it out of the drawer. Let's do this, she said, smiling. It'll be fun. Maybe you really are part Viking. I laughed and agreed. Why not? It seemed harmless enough, and honestly, after the year we'd had, a little fun was exactly what we needed. So we spit in the vials, sealed them up, and mailed them off. I forgot about it again until a letter arrived in my mailbox. Your DNA results are ready. Read the subject line of the email. I clicked on it more out of curiosity. I wasn't expecting anything amazing, maybe a mix of German and Irish, like my mom always said. But as I flipped through the list of ancestors, something caught my eye. There was a section that said, paternal relationship. We found a biological connection. I clicked on it, expecting to see a distant cousin or a long-lost uncle. Instead, what I saw made my stomach churn. It was my son. Or, to be more accurate, not mine. My oldest son, Ben, was not listed as my biological child. The system was clear, no genetic match to paternal DNA. I reread that line over and over again, feeling like all the air had been pumped out of the room. My first thought was that it had to be a mistake. These things aren't perfect, right? There's always the possibility of making a mistake. But the more I looked at it, the harder it was to shake off the feeling that something was wrong. I hadn't told Sarah. Not right away. I didn't even know how to start this conversation. Instead, I spent the next few days obsessively researching everything I could about DNA tests, false results, anything to prove that what I'd seen wasn't real. But the more I read, the clearer it became. The test wasn't wrong. One night, after Sarah had gone to bed, I pulled out the box and stared at it as if it had the answer to all the questions I had in my head. And then it hit me, Greg. He'd given us the kit. And now, for the first time in years, I wondered why. At first I dismissed the thought. It was Greg, for God's sake. My best friend since college. The guy who'd helped me move into my first apartment, who'd held my hand at my father's funeral. There's no way he could have known what that test would show, right? But then I remembered the little things. The comments he made occasionally, the way he teased Sarah when we were all younger and drunker and stupider. I remembered how he offered to babysit Ben when he was very young, saying, I'm basically his uncle. I hadn't given it much thought at the time. Now, however, those moments seemed like puzzle pieces that I didn't know how to put together. I began to notice something about Sarah, too. She seemed nervous, even jumpy, as if she sensed something was wrong with me. And I don't think she was wrong. Every time I looked at Ben, my heart broke even harder. He's my boy, with my sense of humor, with my stubbornness, with my love of baseball. But now I couldn't stop wondering. If he's not mine, whose is he? I thought about addressing Sarah right away, but every time I opened my mouth, the words got stuck. What was I supposed to say? Hey, honey, remember that DNA test we did for fun? Well, surprise, surprise, I'm not Ben's father. Just thinking about it made me sick to my stomach, so I kept my mouth shut. For now, instead, I began to watch, waiting. looking for any sign that Sarah might know more than she was saying. And the more I watched, the more I began to wonder if this was a joke on me. Funny how something so small, a few words on a screen, can turn your whole world upside down. In fact, that's what it was all about. Just one line in the DNA report. Nothing more than a few pixels and bytes of data, but I couldn't stop looking at it. No genetic match to father's DNA. That line made me sit in the dark at the kitchen table at 2 in the morning, my laptop glowing dimly and my stomach rumbling like I'd eaten bad sushi. Sarah had gone to bed hours ago. She kissed me goodnight, probably thinking I was just typing email or watching some stupid video. She didn't know that everything I thought I knew about my life was unraveling one painful thread at a time. I tried to distract myself, opening Facebook, scrolling through Reddit, even clicking on one of those articles about UFO sightings. But my thoughts kept coming back, like a dog chasing its tail. My son, Ben. My boy who used to give me crayon drawing cards for Father's Day and call me Super Dad. He wasn't mine. I closed my laptop and stared into the darkness of the room, the quiet hum in my ears sounding louder than it had any right to be. My gaze stopped at the family photos on the wall. One showed Ben holding his little sister in his arms, his big blue eyes full of pride. Next to him was a picture of me, Sarah and the kids on our last trip to the beach. My arm around her shoulders, her smile as bright as the sunlight on the waves. We looked so normal, happy, like a family you might see in a minivan commercial. Now it seemed like a lie. I didn't want to believe it. I told myself it had to be a mistake, some glitch in the system, a mix-up in the lab. But deep down, I knew that's not how it works. That's not how things work in science. Worst of all were the questions. They wouldn't stop, and I had no answers. When? How? Why? I went over our entire relationship in my head, every moment, every memory, trying to find the cracks I must have missed. Maybe it was that weekend she'd gone to her sister's house, or that work conference she swore was boring. Had it been going on for months? Years? Or was it just one night, one stupid, reckless decision? And Greg, damn him. My hands clenched into fists at the thought of his smug face. He'd given us the DNA test kit as a joke, but now I couldn't help but wonder if he'd known. Was it just a coincidence? Or had he been keeping this secret all along, waiting for the right moment to drop the bomb? I kept picturing him and Sarah together, and every time I felt like someone was driving a nail into my chest. I hated myself for it, for letting my thoughts drift there, but it was like trying to stop a freight train. At some point, I heard the bedroom door creak open. Sarah walked into the kitchen, her hair mussed from sleep, her eyes half closed. "Mike," she muttered, her voice thick with fatigue. "What are you doing?" "Just thinking," I said, trying to sound casual. I knew she could see right through me. She always did. "About what?" she asked, leaning against the door jamb. I shrugged, avoiding her gaze. "About work." She frowned. "You've been weird all day. Is something going on?" For a split second, I thought about telling her. Just rip off the Band-Aid and see her reaction. But I couldn't do that. Not now. I didn't have the energy for what would follow next. The tears, the excuses, the lies. "I'm fine," I said, a little too quickly. "Go back to bed." She hesitated, as if she didn't believe me, but finally sighed and turned back toward the bedroom. "Okay, but you're acting weird," she said over her shoulder. Weird wasn't everything. When she left, I sat there for another hour, maybe 2, just staring into the void. My coffee was getting cold, but I didn't care. I was too busy trying to figure out what the hell I was supposed to do next. I couldn't ignore it. That much was clear. But confront it? It was like stepping off a cliff and hoping I didn't crash into the rocks below. What if she confessed? What if she denied it? What if she tells me Ben isn't mine, but she doesn't know whose he is? Each scenario seemed worse than the last. At some point, fatigue took over. I crawled into bed next to Sarah, trying not to wake her, and stared up at the ceiling until the first rays of sunlight broke through the blinds. The next morning she asked again if anything was wrong. I dodged the question by saying I was just tired, and she left it at that. But I knew I couldn't go on like this forever. Sooner or later I would have to face her. To ask the questions I didn't want to know the answers to. But not now. Not now. The morning was crisp and quiet, the way mornings in our house usually are before the chaos of two kids waking up. Sarah was already up, sitting at the kitchen table with her coffee and flipping through her phone like she did every morning. Her hair was still a little disheveled from her nap, and she was wearing an old sweatshirt that I teased her for, but secretly loved because it made her look so homely, so real. I froze for a second, watching her and trying to decide if this was the right time to say something. My stomach rumbled, and my heart felt like it was racing out of tune. I'd replayed the scenario in my head dozens of times, imagining every possible scenario, and none of them felt right. But I couldn't hold it in any longer. I sat down across from her, setting the coffee mug down on the table with force. She looked up, frowning her eyebrows. "Are you okay?" she asked. "Yeah," I replied, my voice too flat to be convincing. "I need to talk to you about something." Her eyes went back to the phone for a second, as if she was contemplating whether to put it down. Eventually, she put it aside and gave me her full attention. "What's going on?" I reached for my laptop, which I'd left on the counter, and opened the email from DNA. My hands shook as I held the letter out to her across the table. "What's this?" she asked, her voice light, but I could see the tension starting to show on her face. "It's from that DNA test," I said. "The one Greg gave us." She clicked on the letter and started reading. At first her expression didn't change much, just a blank, curious look that people get when they're trying to make sense of something. But then her face paled, her eyes racing across the screen as she reread the same line over and over again. I saw the exact moment when it hit her, when she realized what I was showing her. "Mike," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't let her finish. "Is it true?" I asked, my voice firmer than I expected. Her mouth opened and closed a few times, but no words came out. She looked like she wanted to say something that would make her forget about it. Finally, she shook her head, her voice shaking as she spoke. "This has to be a mistake." "It's not a mistake," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I've checked everything. These tests don't just go away. So I'm going to ask you one more time, Sarah. Is it true?" For a moment, she just stared at me, her eyes widening and glazing over. Then she slowly lowered her head onto her hands. I thought she was going to cry, but she didn't. She just sat there with her shoulders hunched and shallow breathing. "It was one night," she finally said, her voice muffled by her hands. Her words came crashing down on me like a freight train. I felt like all the air had been sucked out of the room, like I was falling and had nothing to hold on to. "What do you mean, one night?" I asked, raising my voice. She raised her eyes to me, and there was something in them that I couldn't define. Guilt, maybe, or shame, or just fear. "It was years ago," she said. "It was stupid. I was drunk, and it didn't mean anything. I swear, Mike, it was just one night. I didn't even know." "You didn't know?" snapped I, interrupting her. "You didn't know he was Ben's father? Or you didn't know how to tell me you slept with my best friend?" She flinched as if I'd slapped her. "I didn't know," she said quietly. "I didn't know Ben wasn't yours. I swear I didn't know." Her words were like knives, each one cutting a little deeper. I wanted to believe her. God, I wanted to believe her so badly. But how could I? She'd kept it from me for years. Let me believe Ben was mine. Let me build my whole life on a lie. And Greg, the thought of him made my blood boil. He knew all along, didn't he? That's why he gave us the test. Why he was so damn smug. He wanted me to know. Wanted to blow up my life. "Why?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Why him?" She shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "I don't know," she said. "I was lonely, and he was around. You were working so hard, and I felt us drifting apart, and I made a stupid, terrible mistake. I've regretted it every day since." I stared at her, my thoughts racing. Part of me wanted to scream at her, shout, curse, and throw something across the room. But another part of me, maybe the part that still loved her, just felt empty. "What do we do now?" I asked, my voice shaking. She didn't answer. She just stared at me, her face pale and tear-filled. And for the first time since I married her, I didn't know what she was thinking. I pushed back my chair and stood up. I couldn't sit here anymore, couldn't look at her, couldn't be in the same room. I need some air, I said, grabbing my jacket. Mike, she started, but I didn't let her finish. I walked out the door and didn't look back. That night, I didn't go home. Instead, I drove my car. No destination, no plan, just me, the car, and the open road. The hum of the engine drowned out my thoughts for a while, but eventually the weight of everything came back on. Sarah's confession. Ben. Greg. The more I thought about him, the angrier I got. His smug smile as he handed me the DNA test ran through my mind like a taunt. He knew. He had to know. Just thinking about it made my blood boil. I gripped the steering wheel so tight my knuckles turned white, imagining it was his neck. When I finally pulled into his driveway, the sun was starting to rise. His car was parked out front, and the sight of it sent a new wave of anger through me. I turned off the engine and stood still for a moment, my heart pounding in my chest. This wasn't like me. I wasn't prone to violence. I've always prided myself on keeping my cool, on remaining poised in any situation. But this was different. I got out of the car and headed for the door, each step fueled by rage. I didn't bother knocking. I pounded on the door with my fists until I heard footsteps on the other side. The door was opened by Greg, looking half asleep and completely unconcerned. Mike, he said, wiping his eyes. What the hell, man? It's barely 6. I didn't let him finish. I shoved him hard, and he stumbled back into the hallway. Hey, he shouted, raising his hands. What's your problem? You're my problem, I shouted, slamming the door behind me. You set me up for this test on purpose, didn't you? You knew what it would do. For a split second he looked surprised. Then a smug smirk appeared on his face, making me want to punch him in the face. I take it Sarah told you, he said, leaning casually against the wall like it was some kind of game. Looks like the cat's out of the bag, doesn't it? I stepped closer, clenching my fists at my sides. You think this is funny? You think blowing up my family is a joke? His smile didn't waver. It's not a joke, Mike. Just justice. Justice? I spat. What the hell are you talking about? He straightened, his tone changing from smug to serious. You've had everything I've ever wanted. Sarah. A family. A life. And you didn't even appreciate it. You were always working, always too busy to notice what you had right in front of you. So what? Snapped I. You thought you were just going to take it all for yourself? He shrugged. I didn't have to take anything. Sarah came to me, remember? I didn't make her cheat on you. It was all her. His words struck me like a punch to the gut, but I didn't put it out. And the DNA test? I asked, my voice cold. What was that? A gift from the heart? He smirked again. Call it a little nudge. I knew you'd find out sooner or later. Just thought I'd speed up the process. The calmness in his voice gave me goosebumps. He didn't feel guilty. He didn't feel remorse. He felt satisfaction, like he'd won some sick game. What's your goal, Greg? I asked, my voice low and steady. You think Sarah's just going to run away with you? That we'll all forget that you ruined our lives? He laughed a short, bitter sound that made my blood boil. She doesn't need to run away with me, Mike. She's already halfway out the door. You just don't want to admit it. That was it. Before I realized what I was doing, I grabbed him by the collar and pinned him against the wall. His smirk faltered for the first time, and fear flashed in its place. You don't know shit about my family, I growled. It's not up to you to decide what happens to us. You're just a coward who can't stand to see someone else happy. He didn't fight back, didn't even raise his hands. He just stared at me, his expression unreadable. Are you done? He asked, his voice calm again. I let go of him, taking a step back. My hands trembled and my chest heaved with every breath. I wanted to punch him to knock that smug look off his face forever, but I knew it wouldn't fix anything. Greg adjusted his shirt, brushing away some imaginary dust. You know, you should thank me, he said. I did you a favor. At least now you know the truth. I stared at him, clenching my jaw so hard it hurt. I wanted to say 100 things, but none of them would change what had already happened. Without another word, I turned and walked out the door. I sat in the car for a long time, staring at the steering wheel. The anger was still burning in my chest, but now there was something else mixed in. confusion, helplessness. Greg's words echoed over and over in my head. At least now you know the truth. But what exactly was the truth? That my wife had betrayed me? That my best friend orchestrated all of this? That my son, the boy I'd raised as my own, wasn't mine? The truth was confusing, painful, and impossible to unravel, and I had no idea what to do next. After leaving Greg, I drove aimlessly around the city for hours. I couldn't go home, not now. Not now, not when things were still so bad. My hands were still shaking and my chest felt tight, like a rubber band wound too tight and ready to burst. I'd thought that meeting Greg would bring me some clarity, but all it had done was confuse things even more. The sun was already high when I finally pulled into a random parking lot. It was the park I used to take Ben to when he was little. There was a bench under a tree, the same one I used to sit on while he played on the swings. I parked the car and got out. I needed space to breathe and think. I sat on the bench looking at the empty playground and my thoughts raced. Ben. My boy. I couldn't stop thinking about him. About the way his face lit up when I came home from work. About bedtime stories and baseball games and all the moments we shared. Moments that weren't built on DNA, but on something deeper. How could I let this ruin his life? He wasn't asking for any of this. He hadn't asked to be the product of a mistake. Hadn't asked to have his world turned upside down because the adults in his life couldn't hold their own. I ran my hands over my face, trying to push the thoughts away, but they kept coming. I was furious, but not at Ben. Never at him. I was angry at Sarah and Greg and the decisions they'd made that had brought us here. But Ben? He was innocent. And as much as I hated the situation, as much as I was torn apart by learning the truth, I couldn't take my anger out on him. The sound of a text notification brought me out of my reverie. I pulled my phone out of my pocket and saw Sarah's name on the screen. Please come home. We need to talk. I stared at the message, pointing my thumb at the screen. For a second, I thought about ignoring it, but I knew I couldn't avoid it forever. As much as I wanted to, I couldn't just run away and hope it would fix itself. I took a deep breath and quickly typed a reply. On my way. When I walked through the door, Sarah was sitting on the couch, her face pale and her eyes red. She looked like she'd spent the whole night crying, and part of me wanted to feel sorry for her. But the other part, the part that was still seething with anger, reminded me that she was the reason for all of this. Mike, she said quietly, standing up as I walked in. I held up my hand, stopping her before she could get any closer. Just tell me what you want to say, I said in a flat voice. She hesitated, then nodded, sitting back down. I remained standing, leaning against the wall and crossing my arms, waiting for her to begin. I don't even know where to start, she said, her voice shaking. I made a mistake, a terrible, monstrous mistake, and I've lived with the guilt of it for years now. But I never meant to hurt you. I never wanted it to come out. You didn't want it to come out? I repeated, my voice sharper than I wanted it to be. You mean you didn't want to face the consequences? She flinched, but didn't argue. Maybe, she admitted, but I love you, Mike. I love our family, and I'll do whatever it takes to make things right. Her words hung in the air, heavy and empty at the same time. I wanted to believe her. God, I wanted to believe her so badly. But how do you rebuild trust when it's shattered into a million shards? What do you want me to do? I asked, my voice quiet but firm. Just pretend it didn't happen? Pretend it's okay while I carry this around for the rest of my life? She shook her head, tears streaming down her face. No, I know it's not that simple, but I'm begging you, Mike. Please don't let this ruin everything. Don't let this ruin Ben's life. He's your son, no matter what the DNA test says. Her words hit me harder than I expected. She was right. Ben was my son. He always would be. But that didn't make it any easier. I spent the next few days in the routine of life. Work, home, dinner, bedtime. It was like I was on autopilot. Sarah tried to give me space, but I felt like she was watching me, waiting for some sign that I had forgiven her. I couldn't give her that. I couldn't yet. At night, when the house was quiet, I stood in Ben's room and watched him sleep. His little face looked so peaceful, so innocent, and it broke my heart all over again. He didn't realize what was happening, didn't know that his whole life was built on lies. How could I protect him from that? How could I keep his world intact when mine was crumbling around me? I thought about telling him the truth, but every time I imagined the look on his face, the way he would feel betrayed by both of us, I couldn't do it. He was too young, too innocent. He deserved better than this mess. For now, I decided this secret would stay between Sarah and me, at least until I decided what the hell I was going to do. We had a family outing planned for the following weekend, a trip to the zoo that we promised the kids weeks ago. I considered canceling, but I couldn't bring myself to disappoint Ben and his little sister. The day was warm and sunny, the kind of day that usually puts me in a good mood. But as we walked around the zoo, watching the kids marvel at the animals, I felt like I was watching someone else's life. Ben ran ahead to the tiger exhibit, and his face lit up when he pointed to a huge cat lying in the sun. "Daddy, look at that!" he shouted, his voice full of delight. I forced myself to smile and walked over to him, crouching down to be on his level. "Cool, huh?" I said, ruffling his hair. In that moment, looking into his bright blue eyes, I felt such a rush of love that it almost knocked the spirit out of me. He was my son, no matter what. And for his sake, I would find a way to get through this. If I thought things couldn't get any worse after Sarah's confession, I was sorely mistaken. Turns out betrayal isn't just one blow. It's more like dying from 1,000 cuts. Just when you think you've hit rock bottom, the ground crumbles beneath you, and you fall again and again. It all started with a phone call. I was in the garage, trying to forget myself while repairing the lawnmower. The engine had been running for a few weeks now, and fiddling with it was the perfect distraction. My hands were in grease and my head was already half hidden under the hood when my cell phone buzzed in my pocket. I almost ignored it, but something told me to check it. When I pulled it out, Greg's name popped up on the screen. It gave me a twitch. I hadn't spoken to him since the confrontation at his house, and I wasn't about to change anything. But curiosity got the best of me. I hit the answer button. "What do you want?" I asked, keeping my voice steady even though my heart was racing. His laughter on the other end made me get goosebumps. "Relax, Mike. Just thought you might want to know how things are going." I gritted my teeth. "We don't have anything to talk about." "Oh, but we do," he said, smugness evident in his tone. "You see, I'm sick of waiting. I love Sarah, and I'm tired of pretending I don't." My blood ran cold. "What the hell are you talking about?" "You know exactly what I'm talking about," he said. "She and I are meant to be together. We have a son. For God's sake. It's time to stop playing house and make it real." For a second, I couldn't even comprehend what I was hearing. "You're crazy," I finally said. "Am I?" he replied. "Or are you just afraid to admit that your little fairy tale is over?" I couldn't stop myself. "You think she'd leave me for you? You think after everything you've done, she's just going to pack up and walk out the door?" His laugh was low and confident, the kind that made my stomach rumble. "She doesn't have to leave, Mike. She's already halfway there. Why do you think she kept it from you for so long? She didn't want to derail her backup plan." "Backup plan?" I repeated, my voice rising. "That's who you are, buddy," he said, his tone almost pitiful. "The guy she settled on. The safe choice. But now, she's got a choice. She doesn't need you anymore." I wanted to reach for the phone and punch him, but all I could do was clench my fist so hard it hurt. "You're delusional," I said, my voice shaking with rage. "We'll see," he said, his voice calm and confident. "Just don't be surprised when she makes her choice. And don't say I didn't warn you." The line cut off before I could respond. I stood frozen in place for a moment, staring at the phone in my hand, my heart pounding like a drum. When I entered the house, Sarah was in the kitchen, chopping vegetables for dinner. When she saw me, she looked up and her face lit up with a smile I couldn't bring myself to return. "Hi," she said, her tone cautious. "Everything okay?" I put the phone down on the counter and crossed my arms. "Greg called me." Her knife froze mid-slicing, and the color faded from her face. "What did he say?" I didn't answer right away. Instead, I watched her, waiting for a hint of guilt or betrayal. She looked at me again, her eyes widened and nervous, but there wasn't an ounce of the confidence in them that Greg had. "He says he loves you," I finally said, "and he wants you to leave me for him." She flinched as if I'd slapped her. Mike, is that true? I interrupted her, my voice sounding sharper than I wanted it to. No, she said, shaking her head frantically. God, no. I don't know why he said that. I haven't spoken to him since. Don't lie to me, Sarah, I said, interrupting her again. I need the truth. All of it. She set the knife aside and turned to face me, her eyes filling with tears. I swear to you, Mike, I have no intention of leaving you. I love you. I love our family. Whatever Greg thinks, he's wrong. Her words sounded sincere, but after everything that had happened, how could I trust them? So why is he so sure of himself? I asked, my voice quieter but no less strained. What makes him think you'll choose him? Her tears came in streams, and she covered her face with her hands. I don't know, she said in a muffled voice. Maybe he's convinced himself it's true. Maybe he thinks he's entitled to me because of Ben. But I promise you, Mike, he's wrong. He's very wrong. I wanted to believe her. God, I wanted to believe her so badly. But the doubt was still there, creeping up to the edge of my consciousness. Then prove it, I said, my voice firm. Cut him out of our lives. No more calls, no more texts, nothing. If you're serious, you're done with him. Forever. She nodded, her hands shaking as she wiped away her tears. Okay, she said. I'll block his number. I'll do whatever it takes. For the first time in days, I felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe we could get back to this. That night, after the kids had gone to bed and the house was quiet, I sat in the living room looking at the family photos on the wall. Thoughts still raging in my head. I replayed Greg's words over and over again. I didn't know if Sarah was telling the truth. I didn't know if I could trust her again. But one thing I was sure of, Greg wasn't going to let this go without a fight. And neither was I. I thought things would calm down after Sarah agreed to cut Greg out of our lives. For a while, I even thought it would. She blocked his number and deleted him from her contacts. And for a few fleeting days, I let myself believe that we were finally moving forward. But then the cracks started to show. That's the way it always happens. At first, it was little things. Sarah would jump up when her phone rang, or seem more nervous than usual. She started going out for walks alone, something she'd never done before. Just clearing my head, she said when I asked about it. But from the way she averted her eyes, I realized it wasn't just that. Then there were questions from friends. Random, seemingly innocent questions that had me on edge. Are you doing okay? My buddy Tom asked one day while we were having a beer. Why wouldn't I be? I asked, keeping an even tone. He shrugged, looking a little uncomfortable. I don't know. Sarah just seemed different the last time we got together. Didn't say anything, kept checking her phone. I thought maybe something was going on. I brushed it off, told him we were fine. But the truth was, I didn't know if we were okay. And the more I thought about it, the more I began to doubt everything. One night, after Sarah went to bed, I decided to check her phone. I'd never done it before, in all the years we'd been together, but something inside me clicked. I needed to know. Her phone was on the kitchen table, charging. I picked it up, my heart pounding in my chest, and unlocked it. At first, I didn't see anything out of the ordinary. The usual apps, a few group chats with friends, pictures of the kids. But then I opened her messages, and there it was, Greg's name, at the very top of the list. My stomach churned. She promised me she was done with him. She had promised. The messages weren't long, just a few lines. But they were enough to make my blood boil. Please stop calling me. We can't talk anymore. You need to leave us alone. At first glance, it seemed like she was trying to push him away. But the fact that she continued to communicate with him at all felt like a betrayal. How could I trust her if she couldn't even keep that promise? I put my phone down and went to bed, but sleep wouldn't come. My mind was racing, going over all the moments of the past few weeks, trying to make sense of what had happened. Was she really trying to keep him at a distance, or was there more to their conversations than she was saying? The next morning, I made a decision. I couldn't live like this, constantly doubting her, constantly questioning everything. I needed clarity, and I wasn't going to get it from Sarah. So I hired a private investigator. I met the detective, a laid-back guy named Jim, at a coffee shop a few towns away. He was in his early 50s, had a weathered face and a calm, confident demeanor that immediately put me in the right frame of mind. "Are you sure you want to do this?" he asked when I told him the situation. "I don't see any other way," I replied. "I need to know the truth." He nodded. "Okay, I'll look into it, but you have to be prepared for what I find. It may not be what you want to hear." "I'm already living the worst-case scenario," I said. "Right now I just want answers." After that, the days dragged on. Every time the phone rang, my stomach twisted into knots at the thought that it was Jim with the news. I tried to live as normal a life as possible, work, kids, pretending everything was fine, but the weight of it all was suffocating. Sarah noticed, of course. How could she not notice? "You've been so aloof lately," she said one night as we were getting ready for bed. "Just work stuff," I lied, avoiding her gaze. She didn't press me on it, but I could tell she didn't believe me. Part of me felt guilty for not telling her about the investigator, but another part of me justified it. She was keeping secrets from me. Why shouldn't I do the same? A week later, Jim called. "I've got something," he said. We met at the same coffee shop, and he handed me a manila folder across the table. My hands trembled when I opened it, revealing a series of photos and printed messages. The photos showed Sarah meeting Greg in the parking lot, their faces tense as they talked. There was no physical contact or signs of affection, but the very fact that they were dating at all was like a punch in the gut. "She met with him twice last week," Jim said, "both times in the same place. The conversations were brief, and as far as I can tell, they didn't seem particularly friendly. But it's obvious they're still in contact." I nodded, my throat too constricted to speak. "And the messages?" I asked finally. "They match what you found on her phone," he said. "She's telling him to back off, but he's persistent, keeps pushing for more." I stared at the pictures, my thoughts darting around. On the one hand, it seemed like Sarah was telling the truth. She wasn't encouraging him, wasn't responding to his feelings. But on the other hand, she was still hiding it from me. Still hiding it. "What do you want to do now?" asked Jim. I didn't have an answer. That night I sat in the living room and stared at the folder on the coffee table. The kids were already asleep and Sarah was upstairs reading. I knew I needed to talk to her, but just thinking about it made my chest ache. I was trapped between wanting to believe her and the cold, hard evidence lying in front of me. For the first time in my life, I didn't know if love was enough. I sat at the kitchen table and stared at the manila folder Jim had handed me that afternoon. It was open and its contents were spread out on the table like a map of my unraveling life. Pictures of Sarah meeting Greg in that dimly lit parking lot. Screenshots of their text messages. Evidence that should have made everything clear. But instead of clarity, all I felt was confusion. Sarah wasn't meeting him for a clandestine affair. She wasn't sneaking around behind my back for romantic reasons. According to Jim's report and her own frantic, tearful explanation, she was begging him to leave us alone. That should have made me feel better. But it didn't. I leaned back in my chair and ran my hand over my face. The kids were asleep upstairs, and only their breathing broke the silence. Sarah was in the living room, curled up on the couch with a book she wasn't really reading. I could feel the weight of her anticipation, expecting me to say something, to start a conversation she herself didn't have the courage to have. And why should she? Every word between us now seemed like a time bomb. I picked up one of the pictures. It showed her standing across from Greg, arms crossed, her posture rigid. She looked tense, even frightened. She didn't smile, didn't lean toward him, which might have suggested affection. Her body language screamed, "Stay away." But was that enough? After about an hour of looking at the same picture, I got up and walked out into the living room. Sarah looked up from her book, at least from where she was pretending to read it, and her expression was a mixture of hope and horror. "Hi," she said quietly, her voice uncertain. I didn't sit down. Instead, I stood, holding the photograph in my hand like it was some kind of evidence in a court of law. "You dated him," I said, keeping my voice even. She nodded, her shoulders slumping. "Yes, but not for the reasons you think." "I know," I said. "Jim told me." Her eyes widened, and I saw realization flash in them. "You hired an investigator," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I wanted answers," I said. "You didn't give them to me." She flinched, and for a second I felt guilty. But then I remembered the months of secrecy, the lies of default, the promises she'd broken. I didn't want to burden you with this, she said, her voice trembling. I thought I could handle it on my own. You thought wrong, I snapped back. The harshness of my voice surprised even me. She lowered her gaze to her hands, nervously rubbing the hem of her shirt. I was scared, Mike. Scared of what he might do if I didn't confront him, if I didn't try to talk him out of it. He's persistent. Persistent? I repeated, my voice rising. And that's your excuse? You're afraid of him, but you still meet him in parking lots? You still let him think he has a chance to tear this family apart? I didn't know what else to do, she said, her voice trailing off. I was trying to protect us, Mike. To protect you. To protect the kids. I was trying to right my wrong. Her words hung in the air, heavy and desperate. I wanted to believe her. I really wanted to. But trust doesn't come back like a rubber band. If you stretch it too far, it stays that way, deformed, brittle. I don't know if it can be fixed, I said finally, my voice quieter now. She looked at me, her eyes widened and glazed. Please don't say that, she said. I love you, Mike. I love our family. I'll do whatever it takes to make things right. Just tell me what to do. I shook my head. That's the thing, Sarah. I don't know if there's anything you can do. I can't unsee what I've seen. I can't not know what I know. You kept it from me for so long. How can I trust you again? Her tears began to fall, silently but continuously. She no longer tried to defend herself. She just sat there, her shoulders shaking as she finally realized how deep the hurt she'd suffered was. And perhaps that was what hurt the most. Seeing her like that, broken, remorseful, made it harder for me to hold back my anger. But letting go of the anger meant facing the pain, and I wasn't sure I was ready for that. That night I slept on the couch. Not because Sarah asked me to, but because I couldn't bear the thought of lying next to her and pretending everything was okay. The next morning she left for work without saying anything, and I was left alone with my thoughts. What now? Should I tell her that I forgave her, even though I wasn't sure I could? Do I continue to pretend for the sake of the children, hoping that time will dull the sharpness of my resentment? Or would I walk away, leaving behind everything we'd built together? Neither option felt right to me. That night, after the kids had already gone to bed, Sarah came into the living room and sat across from me. I blocked his number, she said. For real this time. No more texts, no more calls. I swear, Mike, he'll disappear from my life. I nodded, but didn't say anything. And I told my boss that I need to work remotely for a while, she continued, just to avoid running into him. I know it's not much, but it's a start. Her voice was steady, but I could see the fear in her eyes. Fear that it wasn't enough. I'm trying, she said. I know I messed up. I know I gave you every reason to doubt me. But I don't want to lose you. I don't want to lose us. Her words were sincere, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of something I hadn't felt in a very long time. Hope. It wasn't much. Just a spark. But maybe it was enough to keep going. When I decided to have a confrontation with Greg, I wanted it to be serious. No more quiet confrontations in private, no more carefully controlled outbursts. This time it was going to happen in front of everyone, our friends, people who thought they knew him, and maybe even thought they knew me. The opportunity presented itself sooner than I expected. One of our mutual friends was hosting a casual backyard barbecue, the kind of get-together where the kids run wild and the adults sip beer while pretending they're not tired. Greg was on the guest list, and so was I. At first I contemplated whether I should go. Just the thought of seeing him, of being in the same space with him, gave me goosebumps. But then I realized it was the perfect setting. He wasn't expecting it, not in a public place, surrounded by people who thought he was just a fun guy. I kept my plan to myself, even from Sarah. She'd been going around me like a needle since her last, "I'm trying" speech, and I didn't want to warn her. If I was going to do it, I had to do it my way. The barbecue was exactly what I expected. Kids splashing around in the pool, dads standing around the grill arguing over the best way to cook burgers, and moms sipping wine on the patio. I spotted Greg almost immediately. He was standing in the corner, laughing loudly at something, his arm carelessly around the back of his chair. I didn't feel nervous. On the contrary, A strange sense of calm swept over me, as if I'd been waiting for this moment for weeks. I picked up my beer, took a long sip, and walked over to him. "Hey, Greg," I said loud enough to get the attention of several people nearby. He turned around and his smile faded for a second before he recovered. "Mike, glad you could make it, buddy." "Yeah," I said, setting my beer on the table. "I wouldn't have missed it. Looks like a good day to air out." His smile strained, but he didn't say anything. "Funny thing," I continued, my voice flat. "You've been playing the role of good friend for years now. Always been there for me at parties, barbecues, game nights. But behind closed doors? Turns out you're just a traitorous piece of trash." The conversations around us stopped. Heads turned. I felt the weight of everyone's attention, but I didn't care. "Mike, maybe we should talk about this somewhere else," Greg said, his voice low and strained. "Oh no," I said, shaking my head. "We're talking about it here. See, everyone needs to know who you really are." Someone cleared their throat awkwardly, and I saw several people exchange worried glances. Greg's confidence was starting to crack, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like I had the upper hand. "This guy," I said, pointing at him, "tried to destroy my family." He jokingly gave me a DNA test, knowing full well that it would show that my son wasn't biologically mine. And why is that? Because he's in love with my wife. Because he was trying to replace me. Sighs rolled through the crowd, followed by whispers. Greg's face turned red and he stood up, clenching his hands into fists. "Mike, that's enough," he said, his voice shaking. "You don't know what you're talking about." "I know exactly what I'm talking about," I said, stepping closer. "I have pictures, texts, a private investigator's report. You can deny it all you want, but the truth is out in the open." He opened his mouth to reply, but no words came. The silence that followed was deafening. The flow of information was instantaneous. People started asking questions, taking me aside to get the whole story. Greg tried to brush it off, claiming I was overreacting, but the damage was done. By the time the barbecue was over, his reputation was in shreds. As for Sarah, she didn't need to hear the details. I told her everything that evening. She sat there with a pale face as I recounted every word, every reaction. "I pulled away from him completely," she said, her voice shaking. "I swear, Mike, he's gone. He's no longer a part of our lives." I nodded, but didn't say anything back. The damage wasn't just to Greg's reputation. It was damage to our marriage, our trust, the foundation of everything we had built. In the weeks that followed, Sarah and I began therapy. It was her idea, and I agreed because I didn't know what else to do. The sessions were hard, brutally honest, and painfully frank. "You both hold a grudge," the therapist said during one of the sessions. "If you can't let it go, it will eat away at what's left of your marriage." "I want to let go," Sarah said, her voice cracking. "I just don't know how to prove to him that I'm still the person he fell in love with." I didn't say anything back. I didn't know what to say. The truth was that I wasn't sure if I could let him go. The betrayal felt like a weight I couldn't shed no matter how much I wanted to. And every time I looked at Sarah, I saw cracks that hadn't been there before. One night, when the kids were already asleep, I sat on the porch and looked out at the dark street. Sarah came out and sat next to me, her presence unsure, like she was afraid to get too close. "I love you," she said quietly. "I know I've made mistakes, but I love you. And I'm going to keep fighting for us, even if you're not sure you can." I didn't say anything back. I just stared up at the stars, wondering if love is really enough to fix something so broken. It's strange how life keeps moving even when it seems like it should stop. It's been months since everything fell apart, since the truth came out, since Greg was exposed as a liar and manipulator. Things look better on paper. Sarah and I are still together, the kids are happy, and Greg is just a bad memory. But under the surface, things are very different. Trust isn't rebuilt overnight. Some days it feels like it hasn't healed at all. I still catch myself doubting that she's being completely honest with me. It's not fair, I know. She's done everything I've asked, blocked Greg, cut him out of her life, dedicated herself to therapy with me. But the doubt remains, like a splinter that can't be pulled out. My relationship with Ben, on the other hand, is the one thing that hasn't changed. He knows nothing about what happened, and I intend to keep it that way. He's still the same kid he's always been, curious, funny, stubborn as hell. When he calls me daddy, it's like balm on a wound I thought wouldn't heal. We've kept our routine. I still coach his little league team. We still watch cartoons together on Saturday mornings, his head resting on my shoulder and him laughing at jokes I don't understand. He doesn't know that he's the anchor that keeps me from completely losing my head. And honestly, I don't think I'll ever tell him the truth. He doesn't need to know that his biological father is a man I despise, someone who tried to destroy the life we built. As far as I'm concerned, I'm his father. Always have been. I always will be. As far as Sarah's concerned, we're trying. That's the best I can say. Therapy is helping, although I'd be lying if I said it was easy. There are days when I feel like we're making progress, that we're finally learning how to communicate in a way that doesn't tear us apart. And there are days when I look at her, and all I see is betrayal. She is patient, you have to hand it to her. She never gets defensive, never pushes me to forgive her before I'm ready. She knows she screwed up, and she admits it. It doesn't make it hurt any less, but it helps. One night, after a particularly hard therapy session, we were sitting on the porch together. The kids were asleep, the house was quiet, and for the first time in weeks, the air between us didn't seem heavy. "Do you think we'll ever be okay again?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I stared out at the dark street, where the faint light of street lamps cast long shadows. "I don't know," I said finally, "but I think we're trying. And that has to mean something." She nodded, her eyes glittering in the dim light. "I'll keep trying," she said, "for as long as it takes." I didn't answer anything. Instead, I reached for her hand. She was surprised, but she didn't pull her hand away. For the first time in ages, we sat together, silently holding hands. Greg hadn't reached out since the barbecue. From what I've heard, his reputation is shaken, and most of our mutual friends want nothing to do with him. It's a small consolation, but I'll take it. I don't think about him anymore. At least, I try not to. But every now and then his shadow creeps into my soul, reminding me of all that we've lost. I hate him for what he did, the lies, the manipulation, the way he tried to get into our lives. But I also hate myself for letting him get so close. That's the hardest part, I think. The guilt. The feeling that I should have seen this coming, should have protected my family better. The kids don't notice the cracks in our lives, and for that I'm grateful. To them, everything is normal. Mom and Dad are still here, still together, still coming to soccer games and school plays. But sometimes, as I tuck them in for the night, I catch myself wondering if we're doing the right thing. Are we staying together for the sake of the kids, or because there is still something worth preserving? I don't have an answer. However, life goes on. It always goes on. Days turn into weeks, weeks into months. Gradually, the sharp edges of betrayal dull, but never completely disappear. There are moments, brief, fleeting moments, when I think we'll make it work. Like when Sarah makes me laugh with her silly jokes or kisses me on the cheek when I make coffee in the morning. In those moments, I see a glimpse of the life we used to have and the one we're trying to rebuild. And maybe that's enough. At least for now. Can love survive such a deep betrayal? I don't know. Maybe it can. Or maybe it will just grow into something else. Something messier, something harder, but still worth holding on to. Only time will tell.